It all began in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. My father, a man deeply engrossed in conspiracy theories, decided to shut himself away in a bunker he had been building for years. He believed the world was on the brink of collapse and that only those who were prepared would survive. Our family didn't believe him. We thought he was just overreacting, but he insisted that the world was ending and that we had to join him in the bunker if we wanted to survive. My father bought the land, and the bunker was part of a military facility that had been abandoned since the 1960s. We had witnessed my father's obsession with the bunker for as long as I could remember. He had devoted his entire adult life to preparing it, stockpiling food, building fortifications, and installing everything necessary to survive any disaster he believed was imminent. We couldn't stop him. He wasn't the best father, not even a good one. But seeing him leave for the bunker with excitement in his eyes, believing he had prepared for the end of civilization, was a bittersweet moment. We could not change his mind, and soon he cut off contact entirely. He would only communicate with us through an old radio, calling once a month, sometimes even less often. The last time he called was 3 months ago. He mentioned discovering a hidden door in the bunker and said he was going to investigate it. That was the last we heard from him. One day, my sister and I decided to go check on him. We drove through the desert under a blazing sun, filled with worry. My sister asked if I thought he was okay, given his poor health. I told her the radio might be broken and to not jump to conclusions. When we arrived, everything looked the same. Dad's truck was covered under a tarp. We approached the steel door of the bunker, built to withstand a nuclear blast. Thankfully, I had the only spare key. Before opening it, I banged on the door and yelled out for my dad, afraid he might mistake us for intruders. No response. I called out again, but there was no answer. I decided to open the door. A foul smell hit us as soon as the door opened. It was the smell of death, the same smell that came from a deer carcass Dad once let rot in the yard when he tried to learn hunting. My sister immediately covered her nose. We descended into the dark, eerie bunker. The power was out, and Dad's method of charging the batteries with an old exercise bike seemed to have failed. My sister suggested waiting outside, but I knew I had to go in. The bunker felt much smaller than I remembered. The walls were damp and the space dark and oppressive. It didn't feel like the place from my childhood. We walked down the hallway and saw the Confederate flag hanging on the wall, a symbol of my father's odd obsession with freedom. It was now a reminder of his confusion. As we reached the main room, I saw something strange. There were 3 plates on the dining table, as if someone had been eating with him. Just then, we heard a noise coming from another room. I called out for Dad again, but there was no response. We ventured further into the room and found a body. The face was eerily familiar, my own face. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Panic set in, and I tried to run, but my sister stopped me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just any body. It was a body that looked like mine, but with a bullet hole in the forehead. As we were in shock, I heard Dad's voice calling for me from somewhere deeper in the bunker. I rushed towards it, but my sister hesitated. She had a bad feeling, but I didn't listen. I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was just someone who looked like me. But as I ran toward the voice, I found another horrific sight. Dad's body was sitting on the toilet, his head blown off, with a journal in his lap. His voice kept calling for help from somewhere else. Was this another version of him, or was I losing my mind? I turned and saw another body, a second version of my sister, dead with her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't make sense of anything. All I knew was that I needed to get out of the bunker, away from whatever horror was unfolding. My sister, Nirali, is a genius. When she was 13, she created a device that allowed her to become invisible to the human eye and speak a universal language that no one could identify or reproduce. I have spent my entire life studying physics, and I still don't understand how she did it or what she did exactly. But I know that in the summer of 2003, everything changed. The laws of physics seemed no longer to apply to her. She became invisible, and she started speaking in a language that sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. We come from a family of highly gifted individuals. My father's a neurologist, my mother works for SpaceX, and my eldest sister is a successful artist. I'm a full-time research associate at a university. But despite all of our accomplishments, Nurali made us all look like children. She was always a step ahead of everyone, constantly surprising us with her intelligence and creativity. When she told me she had discovered a universal language, I didn't believe her at first. But then, one day she demonstrated it. I was sitting at my desk, buried in my research, when I heard her voice behind me. She said something that didn't make sense, and when I turned around, she wasn't there. Her voice was coming from nowhere. She was invisible, and that's when I realized that she had truly discovered something extraordinary. She explained that she could walk through walls and that she was not confined by the normal physical laws of reality. She spoke of atomic frequencies, superliminal desynchronization, and Planck supertemporal parallels. All of it sounded like nonsense to me, but she insisted it was real. She also began to speak in a language that I couldn't understand, but I could hear its meaning in my head. It was as if I could hear her thoughts, not the actual sounds of her words, but the meanings behind them. She spoke in English, but the words didn't match what I was hearing. It was a strange, incomprehensible language, yet it felt deeply familiar. She tried explaining to me how it worked, but I couldn't grasp it. It was all too abstract for me to understand. Nurali, however, seemed at peace with it. She had already moved beyond the confines of normal human communication. As time passed, Nurali grew more distant. She started sneaking into my room at night, speaking in her mysterious language. She explained that she could experience things that weren't bound by time or space. She could perceive the past and future simultaneously. And she had seen cities made of bone and glass, standing in the center of a black hole. But there was something dark lurking in her newfound powers. Nurali started speaking of a shadow behind the walls, something that seemed to follow her, something ancient and dangerous. One night as we lay awake, Nurali froze. There was a palpable sense of dread in the air, something primal and unsettling. She whispered to me that the shadow was near, and I could feel it too. I didn't understand what she meant, but it was clear that whatever was following her was more than just a figment of her imagination. It was real. Nurali began to explain how she could hear things and see things that no one else could. She could interact with the very fabric of reality itself, bending the rules of time and space, but it was coming at a cost. As she continued to experiment with her newfound abilities, Nurali started to lose herself. She couldn't speak English anymore. Her language, the between language, became the only way she could communicate. It was a grotesque, incomprehensible sound that terrified me. She had tried to speak, but all that came out were gurgles and scrapes, sounds that made my skin crawl. The shadow, which had always been present, seemed to grow stronger. Nurali was no longer the same person she had been before. She begged me to help her, but I didn't know how. I didn't understand what was happening to her, and I felt helpless. One night, Nurali whispered to me that the shadow was closing in on her. She could feel it following her, listening to her every word. She couldn't stay in the physical world anymore. She had become something else entirely. I tried to convince her to stop, to come back, but she couldn't. She had already crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The more Nurali spoke about the shadow behind the walls, the more I realized how much danger she was in. She couldn't control the powers she had unlocked, and she was being pulled into a dimension that was foreign to me. She described things that were beyond human comprehension, things that were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. It was as if she had tapped into a force that was ancient, something older than time itself. She saw creatures, entities, and places that didn't exist in our reality, and she was getting closer to them every day. The last time I saw Nurali, she was sitting in my room, silently watching me. She didn't speak, but I could feel the weight of her presence. She was no longer my sister. She had become something otherworldly, and I could see the fear in her eyes. I didn't know if she could still hear me, if she could still understand me, but I knew that she was lost. I didn't know if I could save her, but I had to try. Nurali had crossed into a realm that no one should ever enter, and I was left to grapple with the terrifying reality of what she had become. Her disappearance marked the end of everything I knew and the beginning of something I could never fully comprehend. So much has happened in the last 24 hours. I've barely slept since discovering that Jamie was missing. I'm feeling more and more paranoid with each passing minute. The house is unnervingly quiet, and the atmosphere seems to be closing in around me. It all started when I moved into my new flat and found a survival guide left behind by the previous tenant, Mrs. Hemming. At first, I thought it was just some quirky old advice, but now, after everything that's happened, I know I'm going to need more than a guide to survive. Jamie, my boyfriend, went missing almost 24 hours ago. His work had called me several times, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I had no answers, and I didn't know what to tell them. Panic started to set in when I realized he'd been gone for so long, and I decided to take matters into my own hands. Mrs. Hemming's survival guide mentioned something about not using the lift at certain hours, and I was on the edge of breaking the rule. But I knew I couldn't afford to. I needed to find out what was going on, so I went to the lift to check. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but when the clock hit 3:34 a.m., I hesitated, paralyzed by fear. After what seemed like an endless wait, I finally gathered the courage to go down to the lift. The building's lift was old and creaky, and I hated it. I knew it hadn't been updated in decades, and the building itself felt like it was falling apart. My heart raced as I rode it up and down a few floors, desperately hoping for any clue that might explain Jamie's disappearance. I searched the entire building, my flashlight illuminating every corner, but I found nothing. Jamie had completely vanished. Returning to my flat, I felt helpless, overwhelmed by a mix of grief and fear. I sat down at the table, tears streaming down my face. The guide in my hands didn't offer me any comfort, but I decided to call my friend Georgia. I needed to talk to someone, to calm down, and Georgia promised she would be there in the morning. But for now, I had to wait alone. The next morning, I kept a close eye on the clock, still anxious about Jamie's whereabouts. I armed the apartment with the suggested safety precautions from the survival guide, just to be sure. When the postman arrived, Ian Flanders, I finally saw someone I recognized. I desperately needed answers. I asked Ian about Mrs. Hemming's warning and the strange things that had been happening in the building. Ian, however, didn't seem to be the kindly old neighbor I'd imagined. His gruff demeanor and city accent were completely unexpected, but I didn't have time to be surprised. I shoved the note into his hands, asking if he could help. To my shock, Ian's mood shifted when he read the note. He grew pale, and his expression softened with sympathy. He revealed that something truly horrifying had happened to the people who had used the lift during certain hours. He explained that a few years ago, a little girl named Lila had sleepwalked into the hallway during the forbidden hours and had been dragged away by grotesque creatures. Ian described them as strange, rodent-like entities that had been terrorizing the building for years. Apparently, there was an agreement between the residents and these creatures. If anyone used the lift between 1:11 a.m. and 3:33 a.m., they were fair game. According to Ian, Jamie was most likely dead. He was blunt, but I could see the pity in his eyes. He said that only one person had ever returned after using the lift during those hours, and it was Mrs. Hemming herself. She had witnessed the creatures ripping a victim apart, and the trauma had stayed with her for the rest of her life. Ian told me that it was futile to try and find Jamie. I couldn't accept that. There had to be a way to save him. But Ian warned me that if I kept pushing, I could end up like the other unfortunate souls who had crossed paths with the creatures. Desperate to learn more, I pushed Ian further, but he only gave me fragmented answers about the creatures. He explained how they had overrun the building and how the residents had managed to strike a deal to keep them contained to the lift. If anyone entered the lift during the dangerous hours, they were fair game for the creatures. As terrifying as this sounded, it was my only lead. Ian was no help beyond his initial warnings. He didn't have any real advice, and after he handed me his phone number for emergencies, he left, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. The situation got even stranger after Ian left. I was still haunted by what he had told me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My thoughts were consumed by Jamie's disappearance, and the growing sense of dread that seemed to suffocate the flat. When Georgia arrived, I poured out everything that had happened. She listened, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. Even though I felt that I was going mad, I couldn't stop myself from trying to make sense of what had happened. As the night wore on, I finally gave in to exhaustion and fell asleep, despite the chaos in my mind. But when I woke up hours later, something was different. The night was no longer peaceful. Georgia was sitting on the couch with a strange woman named Natalia. She claimed to live in the flat upstairs, but something about her seemed off. Her smile was too forced, her eyes cold. I tried to be polite, but every instinct told me something was wrong. It wasn't long before I noticed the change in Georgia. She was sweating profusely, her body trembling as if she was overheating. And then the unthinkable happened. Natalia's eyes locked onto mine, and Georgia started to scream. Her skin began to blister and char, as if she were being burned alive. I watched in horror as Georgia's flesh melted away, the sound of her agony echoing in my ears. I rushed to grab my phone to call Ian, but the surface I touched burned my hands. I had no time to think, only to act. I grabbed a knife from the counter and plunged it into Natalia's throat, but she didn't bleed like a normal person. Her insides were black, and she was still moving. I dragged her out of the room and into the hallway, barely escaping the carnage. I quickly shut the door, desperate to keep the nightmare contained. The horror didn't end there. I called an ambulance for Georgia, but I couldn't stay with her. I left her at the park across the street, knowing that if I stayed, I would be implicated in the events that had transpired. I couldn't take any more chances. I had to keep my focus on Jamie. I couldn't believe he was truly gone. I would do whatever it took to find him. Now I'm alone again in the flat, conflicted about whether to stay or leave. I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting for me. I need help, but I don't know where to turn. There's only one person I can think of who might know more. Mrs. Hemming. Tomorrow I'll find her,